Immigration enforcement officers have arrested nearly 4,000 people since the general election. They carried out almost 5,500 visits in response to concerns over migrants working illegally in nail bars, car washes, and restaurants. Many are housed in squalid conditions and exploited by criminal gangs who've trafficked them into the UK with false promises. The news of the arrests, believed to be up 38% on the previous year, comes as Parliament debates the government's Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill. The Prime Minister has vowed to treat people smugglers as terrorists, but human rights group Liberty claims that would set a dangerous precedent. To talk about some of those topics in a bit more detail, I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Ben Ryan. He's the Executive Director of the Medaille Trust, a charity that works with victims of trafficking in the UK. Ben, first of all, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I was particularly saddened to hear in this report today about how some of the workers who were arrested were housed in squalid conditions and working inhumane hours. How much of a problem do you think this is across the UK at the moment?
Sadly, it's an extremely widespread problem. It's very difficult always to calculate the exact numbers because by its nature, this is a concealed crime. It's often difficult to get the kind of real accurate figures on it. But the best estimate is that there's about 120,000 victims of modern slavery in the UK. Now, not all of those are labour exploitation, but a significant proportion are. And certainly we see in our work at Medaille and the service users which come forward and which are referred to us, that these issues of people being abused in workplaces are really widespread. And there's some which I think are probably more familiar to people. People think of the nail bars, they think of the car washes, but actually there's relatively few industries in the UK which are not infested at some level with people being exploited.
Just quickly, Ben, responding to what you've just said there about how there aren't many industries out there where people aren't being exploited in some way. How can we spot it? Because I'm sure that none of us want to play any part in any business that exploits people.
No, of course. And I think that's a really important thing to remember is that this is a supply and demand economy. These people are trafficked in to fill a demand, and it's our consumer demand. And so when that car wash is just a little bit too good to be true in terms of how it's costed, the reason for that is because somebody's not being paid. And I think that applies across a range of industries and services, and some of them are easier for us to interfere with than others. You can perhaps get a sense at a nail bar or a car wash that a relationship between a worker and their boss looks a bit odd, or they seem a bit furtive, a bit scared. But of course, it's much more difficult to know who's grown your carrots, or who's working in the kitchen of that hotel that you stayed at. These things are harder to gather. But there is a responsibility on all of us to be making sure that we use our power as consumers to hold as many companies to account as possible. And there is really good work in that space, but it is difficult. And we also, it should be stressed, that we never want people to put themselves at risk. If you think that something is looking dangerous, something is looking wrong, the first thing to do is to call the police. If it's not immediately dangerous, then still call the Modern Slavery Helpline. It's a free service. You can call the Modern Slavery Helpline or Google them, and they can give you advice and they can do the intervention. They can get people to intervene. Don't go in yourself and try and be a vigilante, but do be on the lookout and do help to kind of build that intelligence picture. Because one of the things that, it's good to see that the government is taking seriously this enforcement thing and sending people round. But realistically, the number of people able to do enforcement on tape farming, for example, the number of farms we've got, the number of abattoirs, the number of kind of bits of the agricultural process which will take food from in the ground to your table, it's very hard for them to possibly police all of those places. But if there are things which people are seeing, then that can really help the authorities to begin to do that a bit more accurately.
And I wonder if you can help us to understand a little bit more about some of the stories that those being arrested might have. We were reading in the report that's on ITV News today about how some of those arrested were tricked into thinking that when they came to the UK, they'd be able to live here and work here legally. How did they get themselves into these positions?
That's sadly a very common scenario, and it's a mixture of ways in which people are recruited. often sadly through family and friends. In particular countries where perhaps there is a lot of poverty or there are difficulties kind of making progress, it will be a family or friend who will say, well, why don't you, why don't you take up with this agency? Why don't you go? We know that this person, there's always the stories. We know that this person went with this agency and they're making lots of money and they're sending the money home. Why don't you follow that route? And agencies in particular, dubious agencies which promise people good legal jobs in the UK, but actually they're not on the level. And some of these are people who are trafficked in, so the initial mode of their entry to the country is illegal in the first instance. But others do come legally and are then exploited when they're here. That was the root of the care home crisis, which you might remember, over the last year. These were people who were legitimately getting visas to work in care homes, but what wasn't on the level was the actual job when they got there. And actually, they weren't being paid properly. They weren't getting the deal that they'd been promised, but they were here legally. Sometimes we're in danger of conflating matters of illegal migration and trafficking and modern slavery. Of course, there are overlaps, but there's also distinctions and differences. And that is one of when I see press releases from government about these enforcement things, of course I want to see better enforcement. Of course I want to see dubious employers held to account. But a lot of the people who are arrested are the people doing the work. And it remains a kind of brutal statement on where we are as a country, that right now in our prisons, it's widely thought there are more victims of trafficking than there are traffickers who are currently in British prisons. So good, but there's enforcement. Good, of course, there's a crackdown on this. That is necessary. But it also needs to be informed by the stories of these victims. It can't be the case that all of the kinds of concerns about illegal migration and labour exploitation fall on the people who are themselves the victims and most vulnerable.
Ben, correct me if I'm wrong here. I always thought that one of the reasons why we struggle to arrest traffickers was that a lot of them are based outside of the UK. Is that actually the reality, or are they here in the UK?
The reality is they're everywhere, but of course, there are structures which are abroad. But even within this country, I'll give you an example of someone that we worked with, where police raided his place of work and they found him and several other people who were mostly from West Africa, who had all been exploited over a long period of time. This is working in construction. So they found the people there, but they didn't find their employer, because their employer doesn't live on the site. And none of the people knew, they didn't have a way of contacting the person that had brought them over. They didn't have a number. They couldn't identify someone. And sometimes, frankly, even if they could, they're loath to do so. Because, of course, if you've come from a small town where there aren't many options and where you came to the UK because you were hoping to send money back to support your family, your elderly parents, your children, a whole widespread family, then you don't want to put them at risk by potentially irritating or putting at risk the person who brought you here. All of the system is stacked against people coming forwards and identifying themselves. To do so puts you at risk of our immigration enforcement systems, which can be quite brutal. No one wants to spend time in detention. People don't want to be deported. They want to be able to send the money back to their family. And they don't want to risk that family's well-being and safety by putting them at risk of the very people that are running these criminal enterprises in the first place. It's very, very difficult to persuade victims to actually talk about and identify the people that have brought them here.
Ben Ryan, a very useful conversation for now. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.